The park lights hummed with a low, dying resonance before stuttering into darkness. Every flicker sent long, jagged shadows stretching across the gravel path, distorting the landscape into a series of shifting, unrecognizable shapes. The air was heavy, smelling of damp earth and stagnant water. Nothing moved in the perimeter. No crickets chirped. No distant traffic hummed against the encroaching night. The silence felt deliberate, a physical weight pressing down on the empty benches and the overgrown hedges that lined the walkway. Above, the clouds obscured the moon, leaving the park trapped in a cycle of dim amber light and absolute, suffocating blackness. Each pulse of the failing bulbs made the metal trash bins appear to lurch forward, then retreat back into the gloom. The gravel path was a narrow, winding vein leading deep into the center of the trees, where the shadows pooled thickest. It was a place designed for transitions, for people passing through, but tonight, the space felt occupied by the absence of life. The flickering intensified, turning the surroundings into a strobe-lit nightmare of rhythmic, dark silhouettes. Something about the way the light died against the pavement suggested that the stillness was merely a precursor to an arrival. The environment had become a trap, waiting for someone to step into the center of the gloom. A slow, uneven rhythm broke the silence. Elias entered the pool of light, his left leg dragging slightly with every step. He stopped, his chest rising and falling in a controlled, rhythmic cadence. He gripped the heavy plastic bag, the weight forcing his spine into a rigid arc. He took another step, his knee locking, then giving way, then locking again. Each movement was a calculated effort against the resistance of his own body. Decades-old shrapnel, buried deep within his hip, dictated the pace of his life. He grunted, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed instantly by the park. He hauled the bag, the plastic scraping harshly against the gravel. His knuckles were white, tendons straining beneath the skin as he maintained his balance. He navigated the path with a practiced, heavy-footed gait, his eyes fixed on the rusted metal bin ahead. He paused to adjust his grip, his breath hitching as a familiar, sharp ache flared in his leg. He pressed forward, ignoring the protest of his muscles, his focus narrowing to the distance between him and the container. He reached the bin, his arm trembling as he prepared to hoist the load. The metal frame of the container loomed in front of him, coated in a layer of grime that caught the intermittent, dying light. He stabilized his stance, prepared to finish the task, unaware of the shape waiting just inches beyond the rim. Elias braced his shoulder against the rusted steel of the bin and heaved. The bag rose, heavy and awkward, but his boot did not find solid ground. Instead, the sole of his shoe pressed into something yielding. It felt like wet, thick fabric. He stumbled, his balance wavering as his weight shifted onto the soft mass. He pulled his foot back, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down. A man was slumped against the base of the container, shoulder pressed into the rusted metal. The light flickered again, illuminating a deep, clean puncture wound in the man's throat. A dark, viscous pool was spreading across the gravel, soaking into the dry earth. The man's eyes were fixed, staring at nothing. Elias stood, frozen, the heavy trash bag still clutched in his hand. The silence of the park felt different now, sharper, colder. He dropped the bag. It hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud that echoed off the trees. He did not look away from the dead man. The blood was still warm, glistening in the dying light. The routine of his evening was gone, replaced by the sudden, violent reality of the corpse at his feet. He took a half step back, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness for a heartbeat, a shadow, or a sound that did not belong. The heavy trash bag lay forgotten, a shapeless lump on the gravel. Elias did not look back at the discarded load. His shoulders dropped, the slump of age vanishing in a single, fluid motion. He exhaled a long, steady breath that cleared his lungs. His spine straightened, the stiffness from his old wounds no longer a burden but a pivot point. He shifted his weight, moving his lead foot forward until it was perfectly aligned with his center of gravity. His hands curled into tight, balanced fists, then relaxed, his fingers twitching with a rhythmic, calculated precision. His eyes stopped wandering. They narrowed, tracking the perimeter of the park with a cold, analytical intensity. Every muscle in his frame pulled taut, turning him from a man who walked with a limp into a coiled spring ready for release. He tilted his head, listening to the wind, filtering out the rustle of leaves to isolate the sound of breathing that was not his own. The air in the park felt heavy, charged with the static of an approaching threat. He did not blink. He did not fidget. He became a stone statue in the center of the path, his focus narrowing to the black void of the bushes. He was no longer waiting for the night to pass. He was waiting for the first sign of movement. The silence broke with the snap of a dry twig. From the dense cluster of bushes to his left, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. Then another. One by one, 6 figures pushed through the foliage, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They fanned out across the gravel path, boots crunching softly as they claimed the ground behind him. Metal hissed against leather as they drew short, jagged blades. The dim park light caught the edges of the steel, sending thin, cold glints dancing over their knuckles. They kept their distance, forming a wide, tightening semicircle that cut off any exit route. Elias stood motionless as they approached, his gaze sweeping from the leader on the far right to the straggler on the left. They stopped 5 paces out. A low, rhythmic scraping sounded as one of them tested the edge of a blade against his thumb. They leaned forward, heads tilted with a sharp, predatory curiosity. One figure stepped into a sliver of light, his face masked by the deep shadow of a hood. He glanced at the others and let out a harsh, dry laugh. They saw the gray in his hair and the stillness of his posture, and they mistook his composure for fear. They sneered, their lips curling as they tightened the ring, closing the distance to make their final move. Elias remained the anchor in the center of their circle. The taunts drifted through the air, sharp and jagged, but he did not acknowledge the sound. His eyes tracked the shifting weight of the man to his left, noting the slight tremor in the attacker's grip. He scanned the ground, mapping the distance between the gravel and the soles of their boots. He saw the way the leader's shoulder dipped, a precursor to a strike, and he adjusted his own center of gravity by a fraction of an inch. The attackers circled, their pace uneven, their confidence growing with every step they took toward him. One of them spat on the ground, the liquid landing inches from Elias's boot. He did not glance down. He kept his head level, his gaze moving like a searchlight from one face to the next, cataloging the reach of every blade, the length of every arm. He could hear the rapid thumping of their hearts, a frantic rhythm that stood in stark contrast to his own slow, controlled cadence. The air between them thinned. The distance closed to a final, critical threshold. Elias felt the tension coil within his own muscles, a dormant power, waiting for the inevitable signal. He did not blink. He stood rooted to the earth, a singular point of calm amidst the circling predators, watching for the first muscle to twitch. The leader moved. It was not a grand gesture, but a slight shift of his lead foot, a subtle expansion of his chest as he lunged forward with the blade held low. The steel whistled through the night air, aiming for the soft space beneath the ribs. Elias did not step back. He pivoted on the ball of his right foot, his body rotating with the fluid grace of a machine that had not forgotten its purpose. His left hand shot out, not to block, but to intercept. He caught the attacker's wrist with a grip like a closing iron gate. The momentum of the lunge worked against the attacker, forcing his own weight to bear down on the trapped joint. Elias applied a sharp, violent twist. The sound tore through the silence of the park, a sickening, audible crack of bone snapping against bone. The attacker's blade dropped, clattering uselessly against the gravel. The man stumbled back, his arm swinging at an impossible angle, his face twisting in a sudden, sharp spasm of agony. He gasped, the air whistling through his teeth as he collapsed to his knees. Elias remained standing, his hand still poised, his gaze already shifting to the next threat. The circle had been broken. The first strike had failed, and the predator had become the prey. The remaining 5 surged forward simultaneously. Elias stepped into the center of the chaos. He caught the second man's throat with an open palm, driving him backward into the metal bin with enough force to collapse the rusted frame. A third attacker swung a blade high. Elias ducked, caught the man's elbow, and shoved it into the attacker's own jaw. A wet, crunching sound followed. The fourth lunged. Elias sidestepped, tripped him, and drove his heel into the man's spine before he could regain his footing. The 5th and 6th attackers turned, panic finally breaking through their aggression, but Elias was already moving. He moved like a shadow through the dim light. He grabbed the 5th man by his collar and slammed his head against the concrete base of the light pole. The final attacker tried to run, but Elias closed the distance in 2 strides, swept his legs, and delivered a precise strike to the base of the skull. The man went limp. It was over. The park fell into a sudden, crushing silence. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the flickering park lights above the carnage. 6 bodies lay motionless on the gravel. The stillness of the park was absolute. Elias stood amidst the sprawled forms, his chest rising and falling in a steady, controlled rhythm. He did not check for pulses or scan the perimeter. He looked down at his palms, smeared with the residue of the struggle. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his hands with methodical, unhurried precision. Every movement was economic, stripped of all unnecessary energy. He tucked the cloth away, his gaze shifting past the row of silent bodies toward the distant streetlights. The flickering light above buzzed, a sharp, intermittent sound that cut through the night. He stepped over the discarded blades, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. He did not pause to look back at the mess he had left behind. The park path stretched out before him, winding toward the exit. He walked with a steady, measured pace, his posture returning to the familiar, slight stiffness that defined his movement. The shadows swallowed his form as he reached the edge of the park. Behind him, the only sign of the encounter was the unnatural arrangement of the shadows on the ground. He turned the corner, his presence fading into the quiet of the city streets, leaving the silence of the park to settle over the aftermath. The heavy door to the apartment clicked shut, sealing out the hum of the city. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of old paper. Elias crossed the floor, his boots dragging slightly on the floorboards. He did not turn on the overhead light. Instead, he moved by the glow of the street lamp, filtering through the blinds. He went to the small kitchen, pulled a cold bottle from the refrigerator, and pried off the cap. The metal hissed as it gave way. He walked to the window and pulled the chair into position. He sat down, the wood creaking under his weight, and leaned his back against the frame. He took a long pull from the bottle, the glass cool against his skin. Outside, the city moved in its usual, frantic patterns, entirely unaware of the carnage left behind in the park. Elias watched the full moon climb higher, its light turning the dust motes in the room into silver specks. His breathing remained even, his hands steady as they gripped the bottle. He stared out into the dark spaces between the neighboring buildings, eyes scanning for movement. He knew the retaliation would be coming. He did not tap his fingers or shift in his seat. He simply waited, the beer bottle warming in his grip, his attention fixed on the growing shadows of the street below. The street below fell into an unusual, heavy silence. The distant hum of traffic faded, replaced by a rhythmic, persistent sound. It started as a faint rustle, the dry grass at the edge of the property yielding to weight. Then came the crunch of heavy boots on the parched earth, moving in synchronization. Elias tightened his grip on the bottle, his gaze locked on the garden fence. From the left, a shadow detached itself from the wall, followed by another. To the right, the darkness between the hedges deepened as more figures stepped into the yard. They moved with a practiced, predatory caution, fanning out until the entire house was bracketed. Dozens of men were now threading through the yard, their silhouettes stark against the pale, moonlight-drenched lawn. Elias did not rise. He tracked the movement of the closest figure, a man pausing near the porch steps to signal his companions. The perimeter was tightening. Every blade of grass seemed to groan under the pressure of the encroaching circle. The air in the room grew thick, vibrating with the collective intent of the men outside. He watched them reach the foundation of the house, their shadows merging with the darkness of the walls, effectively trapping him within the frame of the window. Elias watched the shadows press against the siding of his home. The sounds of breathing and the faint metallic clink of gear reached him through the thin walls. He knew exactly where they were positioned. He set his beer bottle down on the windowsill, the glass making a sharp, final sound against the wood. He stood up, his joints popping, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. The screen was dark, but he tapped it once, illuminating the room with a cold blue light. His thumb hovered over the display, confirming the status of his last transmission. He had sent the message minutes ago. He looked down at the floor, scanned a clear spot near the center of the room, and placed the device face up. The screen remained active, displaying the text, "My house tonight. It is going to get ugly." The light from the display flickered, casting his own silhouette against the back wall. He did not look at the phone again. He turned his back on the glowing screen and walked toward the small closet in the hallway. The silence outside was absolute now, a vacuum waiting for the first spark. He knew they were waiting for a signal, but he had already given them everything they needed to start the fire. The yard was a graveyard of motion. Men crouched behind the garden shed, their shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the illuminated window. Every breath was controlled, held in the back of their throats to keep the silence intact. They communicated through sharp, jagged hand signals, a silent language of tactical intent that cut through the darkness. One man crawled toward the porch, his fingers gripping the underside of the wooden steps. Another shifted his weight near the gate, his hand hovering over a heavy iron latch. They were waiting for the command, the singular impulse that would turn their presence into a storm. Inside, the room remained dead still, the only light coming from the device abandoned on the floor. Outside, the grass stopped rustling. The wind died down entirely. The men were statues of coiled violence, their muscles vibrating with the effort of restraint. They watched the house, waiting for the flicker of a curtain or the sound of a latch. The air grew heavy, almost gelatinous, as the pressure of 100 held breaths pressed against the siding. A ripple of movement passed through the line of attackers as they shifted into their final firing positions. They were ready. The night was pregnant with the coming noise, and the trigger fingers were already straining against the metal. Absolute suffocating stillness gripped the perimeter. The silence broke. It did not fade. It shattered. A single, dry crack whipped through the night air, sharper than a whip snap. A man at the iron gate lurched forward, his hands clawing at empty air before he slammed face first into the pavement. He did not move again. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then, a second crack echoed from the darkness, a precise, calculated strike. A shadow crouching by the garden shed crumpled, his weapon clattering against the stone. Panic bloomed instantly. The attackers, previously statues of discipline, scrambled in the sudden light of muzzle flashes. Shouts erupted from the perimeter, raw and discordant, as the hidden gunmen realized they were being hunted from the shadows. Men dove for cover, but the ground was unforgiving. Another shot rang out, sending a spray of gravel into the air. The perimeter was no longer a trap, it was a kill zone. Figures sprinted blindly, abandoning their positions, their feet thudding against the dry grass in a desperate retreat. The order they had relied on vanished, replaced by the chaotic urge to survive. The night was no longer theirs. The massacre had begun, and the first bodies were already cooling on the lawn. Elias did not wait for the panic to subside. He stepped through the threshold of the house, his stride deliberate and heavy. The yard was a landscape of erratic movement, men stumbling over the bodies of their fallen comrades. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy metal canister, and slammed it against the porch railing. It hissed. A plume of thick, gray smoke erupted, curling outward in a violent, swirling expansion. It clung to the grass, rising rapidly to meet the low-hanging night air. Within seconds, the clear line of sight vanished. The yard became a claustrophobic maze of swirling particulate. The attackers, caught in the open, slowed their sprint. They waved their hands through the dense haze, but the smoke was relentless. It thickened, turning the battlefield into a featureless void. Elias disappeared into the gray, the silhouette dissolving into the murk. The men at the gate stopped firing. They peered into the wall of mist, their faces strained, but they could see nothing. The yard, once a site of tactical positioning, was now a trap of blinding, suffocating opacity. The advantage had shifted. The environment itself had turned against them, and the silence began to return, heavy and absolute, as they waited for the next move from the dark. The confusion lasted only a moment before terror took hold. Trapped within the swirling gray expanse, the men outside reacted with raw, uncoordinated violence. One shadow fired into the void, a jagged streak of orange light tearing through the mist. It was the signal for a cascade of panic. Dozens of muzzles erupted simultaneously, turning the night into a strobing nightmare of flashes. The projectiles did not find a target. They found the house. Bullets hammered the wooden siding, ripping through the structure with a rhythmic, tearing sound. Splinters of wood exploded outward like shrapnel, raining down onto the porch and the crushed grass below. The men were no longer aiming. They were suppressing, firing blindly into the thick cloud in a desperate attempt to drive back whatever was moving inside. Every flash illuminated the dense smoke for a fraction of a second, revealing silhouettes frozen in frantic, repetitive motions. Lead chewed through the walls, turning the exterior of the home into a sieve. The roar of gunfire drowned out the wind, a deafening, continuous thunder that shook the ground. The attackers continued to dump their magazines, their faces illuminated by the recurring harsh light of their own weapons, oblivious to the fact that they were simply tearing apart the very shelter they sought to breach. The continuous thunder of gunfire began to falter, interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic, mechanical wail rising from the distance. It started as a faint ripple in the air, then surged into a piercing, multi-tonal howl that cut through the cacophony. The men in the yard paused their frantic firing, heads snapping toward the street. Through the swirling gray haze, blinding pulses of red and blue light began to strobe against the smoke. Police cruisers rounded the corner at high speed, tires screaming against the asphalt as they drifted to a violent halt. The vehicles skidded sideways, forming a jagged blockade across the road. Doors flew open simultaneously. The heavy thud of metal hitting metal echoed as officers slammed their doors shut, using the cruisers as shields. Suddenly, the battlefield was no longer just the house and the attackers. The arrival of the sirens forced a third, confused faction into the center of the slaughterhouse. Spotlights flickered to life, slicing through the mist and catching the gang members in their harsh white beams. The air grew heavy with the smell of scorched rubber and ozone. The gang members stood exposed, caught between the dark house and the advancing wall of law enforcement. A tense, fragile silence hung over the neighborhood for a single, heartbeat-long second before the environment erupted into a new, deeper level of uncontrolled violence. The standoff shattered. An officer shouted a command, but the sound was swallowed by a sudden, sharp crack of gunfire from the bushes. A gang member had panicked, firing a wild shot toward the flashing lights. It hit the hood of a cruiser, sending a shower of sparks into the night. That single shot acted as a catalyst. The officers responded with a synchronized, deafening roar of automatic fire. The yard transformed into a blinding web of tracer rounds and muzzle flashes. Officers surged forward, boots pounding the soft, blood-soaked earth, but the smoke was too thick. They moved through the gray mist, their weapons raised, unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. Bullets whistled past their ears, striking trees, fences, and each other. The gang members, pinned against the house, returned fire indiscriminately. The air became a lethal storm of lead, where every shadow was a threat and every flash of light signaled another strike. Officers shouted for identification, their voices cracking with adrenaline, but the cacophony of gunfire rendered words useless. The crossfire was absolute. Men fell on both sides, their bodies collapsing into the tall, matted grass as the smoke swirled, hiding the true source of the violence from the men currently dying within it. Elias stepped out from the side door, his presence barely a ripple in the thick gray smog. While the yard roared with the deafening thunder of automatic fire, he remained silent. He moved with a rhythm that defied the panic of the night. He slid behind a wooden fence, his hand gripping the cold steel of his knife. A gang member, blinded by the smoke, stumbled toward him, weapon raised. Elias did not hesitate. He lunged, a single, fluid motion that ended the man's advance before a sound could be made. The body slumped into the mud, unnoticed by the officers just 10 feet away. Elias melted back into the haze. He was a shadow among shadows, navigating the slaughterhouse with surgical intent. He reached an officer pinned behind a cruiser, the man frantic and shouting for backup. Elias bypassed him, instead targeting the sniper positioned in the tree line. He climbed, reached the branch, and neutralized the threat with a single practice strike. He descended, his movements rhythmic and lethal. He was not fighting the war, he was pruning it. Every time he stopped, a threat vanished. The smoke swirled around him, shielding his path as he systematically cleared the perimeter, moving from one target to the next with the cold efficiency of a ghost. The ground grew treacherous. Elias found his footing sliding on discarded weapons and bodies that now carpeted the lawn. He did not slow his pace. He moved through the churned mud, his boots crunching against the gravel and soft, yielding flesh. The yard had shifted from a suburban lawn to a landscape of ruin. Piles of men lay tangled in the mist, their limbs overlapping in the dark, indistinguishable from the debris of the shredded house. Elias stepped over a fallen officer, his gaze locked on a movement near the mailbox. He pivoted, the blade in his hand catching a faint, distant light before it vanished into the chest of a gunman. The man slumped, adding to the mounting stack against the fence. The air here was heavy, thick, with a metallic tang of blood and the suffocating gray fog that refused to lift. Every few steps, Elias found another obstacle. He cleared them with the same mechanical efficiency, never breaking his stride. The neighborhood had been turned into a harvest of silence. Where there was once the noise of gunfire, there was now only the low, rhythmic thud of bodies hitting the earth. He walked deeper into the haze, leaving a trail that stretched from the porch to the street, a path paved in the stillness of those who would never move again. High above the chaos, the police helicopter banked hard, its pilot fighting the updraft from the burning house. The machine hovered, a steady eye in the swirling gray soup. Suddenly, its spotlight ignited. A beam of harsh, white light punched through the thick smog, dragging across the yard like a scalpel. It caught the carnage below in stark relief. Bodies lay scattered across the pavement and lawn, a sprawling, broken mosaic of the night's work. From the edge of the perimeter, a volley of automatic fire erupted. Tracer rounds ignited the air, tearing through the haze in glowing crimson arcs. They crisscrossed the sky, weaving a jagged web of light that illuminated the falling debris and the swirling smoke. The helicopter pilot dipped the nose, circling the perimeter to gain a better angle on the slaughterhouse. Below, the light traced the path Elias had carved, revealing the sheer density of the fallen. Every sweep of the beam caught a new detail of the destruction: a discarded weapon, an overturned cruiser, the absolute silence of the dead. The sky pulsed with the rhythm of the tracers, painting the smoke in flickering, angry shades of red and white. The entire neighborhood was now a stage of high-contrast horror, visible only in the brief, violent flashes of the fight. A new sound tore through the rhythmic pulse of the tracer fire. It was a heavy, grinding mechanical roar that silenced the distant sirens. From the main intersection, an armored SWAT vehicle emerged, its reinforced frame pushing aside a mangled police cruiser like a toy. The massive tires crunched over the debris, crushing broken glass and spent casings beneath their weight. The vehicle skidded to a halt in the center of the yard, the engine idling with a low, vibrating growl that shook the ground. Its rear doors swung open with a sharp pneumatic hiss. A tactical team spilled out, moving in a tight, fluid formation. They held their weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the swirling gray mist for any sign of movement. They moved with a clinical precision that stood in stark contrast to the scattered, panicked firing of the gang members. The team leader signaled with a sharp hand gesture, and the squad fanned out, pushing deeper into the dense, chemical fog. They trampled over the bodies that littered the pavement, their boots splashing through pools of blood without hesitation. The air was thick and stagnant, but they pressed forward, their high-intensity tactical lights cutting short, blinding paths through the haze. They were here to reclaim the street, stepping directly into the heart of the slaughterhouse, with weapons raised and nerves held tight. The tactical team moved with rigid, practiced discipline, their boots heavy against the asphalt. They pressed forward in a single file, the lead officer keeping his weapon leveled at the shifting silhouettes in the smoke. Just inside the perimeter, a man sat on a concrete block, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the house ahead. He was barely 5 feet from the path of the advancing squad. The team leader swept his light past the man, but the beam did not linger. It cut through the air, highlighting only the swirling gray particulate and the jagged edges of broken masonry. The squad marched on, their focus locked entirely on the source of the gunfire at the center of the yard. They moved as if in a vacuum, their eyes scanning for threats that were already gone. The man watched them pass, his breathing steady, his hands resting motionless on his knees. He did not turn his head. He did not flinch as the heavy armored boots crunched inches from his own. The tactical team pushed deeper into the fog, their silhouettes fading into the gray wall of the aftermath. They passed him by, completely oblivious to his presence, leaving him alone in the center of the carnage, a silent spectator watching the authorities walk into a void. The squad pushed toward the front porch, the lead officer's finger hovering over the trigger. They were seconds away from reaching the door when the wind changed. A sharp gust from the west tore into the yard, acting like a giant broom across the pavement. The dense gray wall of smoke began to peel away in ragged, swirling ribbons. The tactical team stopped. The lead officer lowered his weapon, his grip loosening as the air cleared. What had been a chaotic hidden killing ground for the last 10 minutes suddenly snapped into terrifying focus. The team stood in a circle of absolute silence. Where they had expected to find a few scattered skirmishers, they found a carpet of bodies. The ground was no longer visible. It was covered in a dense, overlapping layer of carnage that stretched from the gate to the house foundation. Every member of the squad turned, their tactical light sweeping over the sheer volume of the dead. There was no movement, no moans of pain, no gunfire. Only the unnatural, heavy stillness of 100 lives ended in the space of a city block. The officer at the front took a step back, his boot landing on a discarded blade, the metal clattering loudly against the concrete. They were not in a firefight anymore. They were standing in a graveyard. The squad leader's radio crackled, but he did not answer. He stared at the pavement. Bodies lay in tangled heaps, limbs locked in the final postures of a desperate, failed defense. There were over 100 of them. The sheer density of the dead turned the driveway into a solid mass of flesh and ruined steel. Every few feet, a hand protruded from the pile, fingers frozen in a clawed grip. The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic scent of fresh blood and the cooling heat of spent brass casings. Officers stepped gingerly between the mounds, their flashlights dancing over faces that had been erased by precision strikes. They looked for survivors, but found only the hollow silence of a mass grave. One officer knelt, reached for a pulse, and pulled his hand back as if burned. He stood up, shaking his head. There was nothing left here to save. The team fanned out, their movements no longer tactical, but hesitant, as if the ground itself might shift. They had entered expecting a house raid. They found a slaughterhouse that defied logic. The reality of the scene took hold. This was not the result of a chaotic firefight. It was a singular, surgical termination. The officers stood frozen amidst the rows of the fallen, their weapons hanging limp at their sides, overwhelmed by the quiet, absolute finality of the yard. The squad leader turned his head, his eyes sweeping the curb where the heavy transport had idled only minutes before. He blinked, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the haze to land on nothing but cracked asphalt and oil stains. He turned in a full circle, his boots crunching on spent shell casings. The massive armored truck, a 10-ton steel fortress, was gone. He looked at his second-in-command, who was already pacing the length of the street, checking behind the row of parked cars in the shadows of the neighboring buildings. Nothing. The heavy vehicle had been parked in the center of the kill zone, surrounded by a dozen officers. There were no tire tracks leading away from the scene, no sound of a heavy engine, no broken glass. It had simply ceased to occupy the space it had held moments ago. The team members gathered, their voices low and sharp, questioning the perimeter guards who stood in stunned silence. Nobody had seen it move. Nobody had heard the ignition. The street was empty, the heavy steel plating of the truck nowhere to be found among the ruins of the yard. The squad leader gripped his sidearm, his gaze shifting back to the house, realization dawning that they were not just standing in a graveyard, but being played. The squad leader walked toward a discarded vest lying flat on the pavement, the only item left in the exact center of the empty space. He nudged the heavy fabric with the toe of his boot, revealing a small, stark white square pinned directly to the center of the chest. He knelt, his gloved fingers trembling slightly as he reached out to peel the scrap of paper away from the dark material. His team crowded around him, their flashlights converging into a single, blinding pillar of light. The handwritten note was crisp, the ink dark and steady, showing no sign of the violence that had just decimated the street. He read the words aloud, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "Thanks for the wheels. We'll return later." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The squad leader looked from the paper to the dark, empty horizon, then back at the note. It was not a threat. It was a signature. The perpetrator had not just stolen their equipment. He had dismantled their presence on his own terms and left a receipt in the center of the kill zone. The team stood in the cold night, watching the paper flutter in the wind, finally understanding that they were not hunting a target, but had been the unwitting participants in a performance. The sirens finally died away, leaving a heavy, ringing stillness that pressed against the eardrums. Forensic investigators began moving through the carnage, their white light beams dancing like jagged ghosts over the bodies. They stepped carefully, avoiding the patterns of blood that mapped the final, frantic seconds of the gang members. One lead detective stood in the center of the street, staring at the empty space where the armored truck had sat. He clicked his pen, looked down at his clipboard, and then back at the graveyard of steel and flesh. There was no logic to the layout. The bodies were not scattered in a panic. They were grouped in precise clusters, as if they had fallen to a single, unseen hand. He walked to the house, checking the bullet-riddled siding, then back to the note still pinned to the vest. He touched the paper, felt the crisp edge, and shook his head. There were no fingerprints, no stray casings left behind by the victor, no sign of a struggle beyond the devastation of the attackers. He looked up at the dark, silent skyline, the moon casting long, cold shadows over the street. The perpetrator was gone. The city police stood in the middle of a slaughterhouse, holding a mocking note, completely unable to trace the ghost who had walked through the fire. Miles away from the blood-stained pavement, the heavy engine of the armored truck hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. The city lights were now nothing more than a faint, sickly glow on the horizon, shrinking with every passing minute. He shifted gears, the massive steel frame lurching as he turned onto an unpaved service road that snaked deep into the timberline. The air inside the cabin smelled of stale smoke and engine oil, a lingering reminder of the night. But outside, the wind carried the sharp, clean scent of pine. He did not look back. He did not check his mirrors. The ghosts he had fought were buried in the wreckage of the neighborhood, and he was finally driving toward a silence he had not known in years. The truck hit a series of potholes, the suspension groaning under the weight, but he pushed the throttle harder. He reached out, pushed the heavy door latch to ensure it was locked, and watched the needle climb. The road ahead was narrow, winding, and completely devoid of human life. He was no longer a target. He was a shadow moving through the night, leaving his past to burn in the ashes of a city that had tried to claim him. The neighborhood returned to a silence so profound it felt heavy. Streetlights flickered, illuminating the empty pavement where the chaos had unfolded only hours before. There were no sirens left, no shouting, no movement. The wind pushed a discarded newspaper across the asphalt, the sound sharp and lonely in the stillness. Every house on the block remained dark, the residents locked behind doors, listening to the void. The violence had been surgical, a singular event that had scrubbed the street clean of its threats and its history. What remained was a hollowed-out space, a place where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The moon hung overhead, cold and indifferent, casting long, stark shadows over the quiet wreckage of the night. No one would walk these paths the same way again. The memory of the event settled into the brick and the stone, turning the street into a monument of a man who fought for peace with a blade and a shadow. As the final light on the corner sputtered and died, the darkness swallowed the scene entirely. The city moved on, but this corner of the world remained frozen in the wake of a ghost who had finally found his way home. The screen fades to black.